medical and surgical effects of intestinal worms. I mean, it sounds like something just okay, fine. I take a worm expeller every, 6 months or so, and I'm done. But I think there's a lot more detail into that conversation that we'll be having. So, Dr. Shivachi, good morning.
Morning, Oko. How are you?
Very well, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you.
Karibu sana.
Blessing the chill of Nairobi this morning.
The chill? Is it chilly? Oh,
A
really?
bit.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, compared from where I come from, a bit.
Okay, hold on. What do you mean where you come from?
I'm from Bungoma County. I work in Bungoma County.
You work in Bungoma?
Yes, I
Okay.
do.
All right. So when people tell us it's cold in Bungoma, it's like 25 degrees. So we don't understand. So you must be having an interesting time with 20-degree weather in Nairobi this morning.
Yeah, I'm having an interesting time, but bracing it bravely.
You will be fine.
Yes,
This
I
is the
will.
hot seat of the Situation Room. So definitely things are going to warm up a little bit, regardless of what we're speaking about this morning. So Karibu Sana.
Asante.
Usually CT maybe goes to other places, hot, tropical, cooler. He travels. Well-traveled man, this one. And what he does for this is that he brings back a proverb from every country that he goes to every week. We've been in Rwanda this week, and so you get the privilege of hearing the final proverb from Rwanda, and then you can tell us what you think and how you would interpret that. Is that all right?
That's okay.
Okay. Proverbs, as you've been told from this week, are from the Republic of Rwanda. Caution is not cowardice. Even ants march armed.
That's a good one.
It's a good one, isn't it?
It's a good one.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a very insightful when I think of that.
All right.
It means everywhere you go, everything you do, you have to be prepared, at least. So in this life, as we walk this journey, that means as you walk every day, you're prepared for what comes ahead of you. And being prepared, planning ahead, is not that you're fearing what will come, but you're giving yourself that opportunity to be able to anticipate what is coming, and so your outcomes at the end of the day, I think, will be better in that way.
Sure.
So it's a strength and not a weakness per se.
To be careful.
Yes.
Okay. So as we get into this, the very first part of that, when we talk about neglected tropical diseases, and before we get into, really the detail of when we talk about, medical and surgical care for intestinal worms, neglected tropical diseases, we've had a bit of that conversation previously, but let's go over that a little bit and tell, okay, so when we say neglected by whom, and what exactly are those?
Thank you for the question, Oko. I think they're neglected in the sense that there are things that are with us, diseases that have stayed with us for many years, but in a way we've not really given them that importance that it deserves. Most of the time we hear about it, we talk about it, we have sensitizations about these diseases, but then on the ground, in terms of implementing the real things that will change and bring about eradication of these diseases, we still lag behind in that sense. So it's both at the policy level, both at the implementation level, and even in terms of public health, as citizens, how we relate to these conditions. That's why they're neglected.
And people are suffering from these diseases today.
Very much.
So they're neglected because policy has not been implemented to ensure that at least, even if the management or the eradication of them has not been optimum, like it has been with things like polio, for example. So there are some diseases, and when we talk about the tropics, we talk about maybe areas that, are depopulated. And I say that very carefully because where the center of attention is further away. And do we say that now because of that, it adds to the fact that they would then be forgotten because you don't see the effects of these diseases every single day?
That's an interesting perspective that I would agree with. There are various perspectives to it. One of them is being in the tropics, and majorly the countries you find around the tropics are what we call the developing countries. So that focus, and in terms of how we treat these illnesses, will not have that much of focus on them to the sense that we give them in terms of resources allocation. They deem to suffer a bit than the other normal diseases that we deal with.
Okay.
The number two, the topic of today, which comes to worms. If you look at the tropics, they offer you that climate, the conducive environment for especially these parasites to prosper and really grow. So if you look at terms of reproduction of these worms and these parasites, they'll be better in the tropical areas because of that conducive environment more than you would find them at the northern or the southern countries, per se.
Okay. At the risk of getting a bit queasy this morning, maybe we can just get into it. And then, okay, so when we talk about intestinal worms, what is that?
And what do you call it? What do you call them in Kiswahili?
Intestinal worms, I think we've all heard of them. I think since I was born, our mothers would sing to us about minyo. Minyo. So in Kiswahili, it's what we refer to as minyo. Yes. It's I think every Kenyan household has heard of or been affected by minyo. Or you've seen somebody who's been affected by minyo. So it's a problem that is with us. And if you look at the figures and the numbers, you'll be astounded.
Astound us.
Astound us a little bit.
Astound us a little bit with these figures and numbers.
So worldwide, in terms of according to WHO statistics, around 1.2 billion people are affected in one way or the other or are living with this parasite. That's almost a quarter of the world population.
Are you kidding?
No, I'm not.
1.2
billion. And
is that a historical figure or is it collected over time, or are we talking about currently 1.2 billion affected by worms? Is it a figure that you're dealing with in the moment, or are you saying over time 1.2 billion people have been affected?
No, it's a figure we are dealing with like a snapshot in time. Jeez. At any given point. The statistics I'm talking about would be around 2020, 21 there. So I don't think much has changed, and the figures have remained almost constant for some time now. So that's why it's something that we're bringing into focus so that we can see a way of trying to eradicate these neglected diseases. WHO aims at 2030. Possibly we might get there by then.
Actually, for these diseases to have been neglected, there must be a reason. Why were they neglected in the first place? Because there was a time when they were a problem, and they were considered and they were given attention. And then that attention was withdrawn, hence the neglect.
The neglect is not an intentional neglect. It goes by the nature of these illnesses or diseases. The way they are transmitted, it's trying to address a whole cycle of how they're transmitted. It's addressing terms of mindset change in terms of educating the populace to be able to eradicate. So apart from the medication and treatments that we can offer, if then the populace does not change perspective and we educate them on how to break the cycle of these diseases, and then we have reinfections even if...
Now you are a medical doctor.
Yes.
From what you have observed over time as you've plied this trade, what would you say it is that gives or gets living human beings the attention that they then pay towards certain diseases? Example, malaria. Malaria has been with us for the longest time.
Yes.
It's not neglected.
No.
Correct? Okay. Now, I point to malaria because it's the most obvious one. And yet malaria really kills people. Something like minyo, does it kill people?
Yes, it does.
At the rate malaria does?
Not at the rate malaria does. The problem with minyo now, those statistics are not very clear in terms of the case fatalities for these conditions. But from where I see it as a medical practitioner, there's quite a number of deaths that occur.
You see why I draw that parallel is this. I am attaching death as being something that people actually dread and fear, and a disease associated with it, and something that you see with a certain immediacy and regularly, would draw your attention to that particular disease. Now, one that may kill you slowly, gently, a few people over time. Maybe that's not how it happened, but it's not too bothersome.
I think as well, City, in terms of just numbers, because I was also just going through them, and 1.5 billion is actually the latest stats in terms of people affected by these diseases. And in Kenya alone, 20 million Kenyans are at risk of this. That is almost half the population of the Republic. But even as we talk about these diseases, it is a long-term thing that people usually don't think about. And we talk about matters to do with malnutrition, anemia, stunted growth, and weakened immune system. So we'd say minyoo does not kill, but what it gives credence to now is what is a ticking time bomb.
Okay, so let's talk about this. Where you getting these worms from, right? And let's just, because
are you born with them?
Yeah, we can talk about. And when I think about a worm, I think about the squiggly. I think about the squiggly thing in the mud,
Fishing worm,
the thing you put at the end of a fishing line to catch fish, or the thing that the early bird gets every morning. That's what we think about. But now we're talking about something, and especially intestinal ones. Where do you get them from? How do they present? You can't look at somebody and say, well, you have worms. So what are we talking about in terms of, physiology here?
So in terms of these diseases, we are not born with them. They are not congenital ailments. They are things we pick along the way. If we look at minyoo itself, it has a cycle, what we call a life cycle. And that really entails how this minyoo are transmitted from an infected person to a healthy living person. Usually what we call in medical terms the fecal-oral routes. It means for you to get minyoo, you have to either eat food, drink water, or put some objects that are contaminated with eggs of these worms in your mouth. So you ingest them.
Then what happens?
Then after you ingest those eggs, usually get into your stomach and the intestinal system. Within the intestines, these eggs then hatch into what we call the larvae. The larvae are the young ones of this minyoo.
Okay.
There is a particular worm that is of concern to us that entails almost half of these worms that we call roundworms. We know them as roundworms. In medical terms, they're called Ascaris lumbricoides.
Okay.
They have a very interesting pathway after they get into the intestines. They have the ability to burrow into your intestinal walls. They get into the bloodstream. Then they migrate through other tissues.
So, because I would want to imagine that if their eggs are in food that's contaminated, so we're looking at obviously a hygiene issue,
yes,
right?
hygiene.
It's a hygiene issue. Maybe not clean, hygiene levels have not been attained. So they're resident there, right? They get into the tract. Why wouldn't it be a life cycle of you get in and you get out? So what is characteristic of this worm? Is it a host situation? Is it that this worm, once it's hatched, needs a host in order to live? And then why does it not leave?
So these worms, as you rightly say, somebody has to pass them in stool into the environment.
Yes.
They're what we call geohelminths. Geohelminths in simple terms means that they need the soil as part of to enable part of their maturity. These eggs will only mature once they get out of the host into the soil.
Yeah.
Once they mature, and then you ingest them or take them in, these worms come into your body, so they require you as a host for them to be able to multiply. It's a relationship we call parasitism. That's why they're called parasites, because they entirely depend on you for their nutrition, for their protection. Let's say for your upkeep, you can call them your babies in a way.
Oh, that's disgusting. So, but what's the life cycle then of this particular thing?
So once you ingest the eggs, they get into the intestinal tract, and as I said, interestingly, they burrow or they penetrate the walls of your intestines. Then they migrate through blood, through tissues, liver, through your heart, and then they lodge mostly in the lungs. In the lungs is where this larvae now will mature into young worms. These young worms, then we cough them up. So when we cough them up, I think we'll come to symptoms and how to know who has them. You'll find some patients who present with lung issues because of that. So you cough them up, then you swallow them.
Who swallows them?
You do.
You cough and you swallow the thing? Okay.
Yes.
Let's look at some of the
You said you
symptoms.
cough them up.
But
say
you don't cough them out.
Not out. Up.
Yes.
So, but what's the life cycle though? Because I'm imagining that by the time you speak of this, it's got to be over days. It's not an hour thing. It's got to be. And how long does it from egg to larva to the full-grown maturity? What's the life cycle
We
of
are
this
talking
worm? Does it
about-
not die off?
Now we are talking about 2 weeks to 1 month for you
2
to get
weeks
from
to 1
egg,
month.
Month.
Yes, to an adult grown worm.
Okay.
And how did you say we get this worm again? Where do we find it? Where does it find us?
Where
rather?
do you find it?
I don't know if it finds you or we find it, but somebody has to pass this worm in. Somebody who is infected usually
Has to pass
has
it
to
on.
pass stool.
Yes.
So this
So
feces
it's found in fecal matter.
matter. This fecal matter is what contains the eggs. This fecal matter gets to the soil. In the soil, the eggs now have an environment. So remember we talked about the tropics,
Yes.
providing that warmth and moist environment for the eggs to grow. So for you to get infected and, as a healthy individual, you have to eat.
So
food.
the unsettling thing here is that it is happening often enough for enough people to the tune of 1.5 billion to be affected by that. So this process of having come into contact with in this fecal oral system is happening too often,
Okay.
isn't it?
Look at the water that some people drink.
Yes.
And look at what else happens in
that water.
Water. The food that people eat, how it's transported,
How
it
it's
is
handled,
stored,
how it's
it is
handled.
Handled.
Yes.
Okay. So, I mean,
This thing is bothering you, isn't
it really is, and I think maybe it's. I think it's important for it to bother us, for us to then have conversations about this, to say then what needs to be done and how do you push, so that Terry, like I said, you can't look at somebody and say this person has worms. So what are the symptoms of this for you to then get it? Because I heard my mom's a pharmacist, and she would say sometimes if somebody was presenting with 1, 2, 3, they need to take a worm expeller, and I would say, how do you even make the connection between what somebody is doing and whether they need to take a worm expeller? So what are some of the symptoms that you would now have to say there might be something here?
So in terms of how these patients present, one, we usually look at them in phases. We usually have 2 phases of infection for these worms. There is the early phase of infection, where now the worms, you remember that migration? After you swallow the eggs and then intestines, then they migrate through tissues to the lungs. Once they get to the lungs, they can give you some symptoms, what we call the early phase symptoms in this disease. So these patients will have some cough. They might have chest pain. Remember, for these lungs, for you to cough them up, they have to move from the blood vessels into the lung tissue. So they penetrate as well, and you have some bleeding. So they might cough up some blood. And then because there is inflammation or swelling around the lungs, these patients will present with probably wheezing. So it's what I call a pneumonia. It's actually called a pneumonia, type of pneumonia that is caused by these lungs. And as a health practitioner, sometimes you need a very high suspicion index for you to be able to catch these symptoms at this stage. Because most of the time when you present to a health facility with a cough, you're coughing up some blood, you have chest pain, you have some fever, people will start thinking about the normal
Tuberculosis,
via or bacterial pneumonia
Infection.
or asthma. So sometimes this most of the affected people will be the children between 1 year and 10 years. So you find we are treating them for bacterial pneumonia. We are treating them for asthma. Some of them, unfortunately, might end up on TB treatment. But in real sense, what is happening is we are in the early phase of
worm infestation.
Worm infestation.
So there's a lot of misdiagnosis then when it comes to this, isn't it?
In the early phase, it can be misdiagnosed, rightly so.
Wow.
Then now we move to the second stage, where now you cough up the worms and you swallow them. Now they mature in you.
Your gut.
in your gut. This now will bring the symptoms that we know. The ones that City and I, the ones that we've been told for years. The ones you have abdominal distension, you might have abdominal pains. These patients might have some vomiting, diarrheal diseases, and that picture of an emaciated child now will come during
with a distended belly.
the second phase of presentation. And then if we don't manage them at this stage, we might end up with what we call the complication stage. I'm a surgeon by profession, and now these are the patients I get to see, the ones who present with the complications.
Like what?
Most of the complications will be because of massive infestation now.
Meaning they've gone and multiplied and multiplied and multiplied.
To give you a perspective, one worm can produce 200,000 eggs in a day.
Okay.
So
These people.
People, worms.
Yeah, people.
If you had 10 of them, that's
In
2 million.
2 million.
Day?
Eggs in a day. Yeah. So
And how often do they produce? How often do they?
they are productive. I think
They're
politicians, if they're humans, politicians will love them because they will be turning out voters every.
In fact, what I'm going to find out is
day.
these worms are they polygamous.
I wonder. Hey, Jermaine. But with this, we're going to take a break and come back and then look at some of the interventions that we take, because one of the things that we hear the most is, every 3 months or 6 months, whatever, take a worm expeller. And then the question is that sufficient? But by the time you're getting to this major infestation, how is this human still alive with one worm able to lay up to 200,000 eggs in a day? I would imagine that person, as a human, as the host now of these parasites, is at below par health completely. Or am I just, because I imagine they're eating something, they're in the bloodstream, they're eating you literally, they're in your bloodstream, they're sucking up everything that you possibly have, you're emaciated.
They're shareholders.
Isn't it? So how do you have any kind of any kind of health when you have that kind of massive infestation?
So the infestations will vary to a degree. If you have a mild infestation, you might get by. You might not even realize in that 20 million probably in this room, 2 of us, if not all of us, might be having a worm or 2.
No, I don't know.
You can get
maybe
by
even 1 or 2 over there.
Yeah, you can get by not even know you have worm infestations. And then there is the moderate infestations. This is where now you start seeing the symptomatology. In terms of these patients will now start presenting because you're sharing food. They'll present with malnutrition, especially protein, vitamin malnutrition, what we commonly refer to as kwashiorkor in the younger children. These children will present with anemia.
Right.
Which means their blood level drastically
drops.
And then now wasting, stunted growth, which now starts affecting their day-to-day life in terms of physical growth,
brain
development, school,
development.
brain development.
And all of this, I mean, we're going to break, but all of this essentially we're saying can actually be handled with a proper hygiene system. Washing your hands, making sure that there's proper hygiene after visiting a restroom or anything, keeping, clean water around you, making sure that your water sources are actually, optimal. Maybe we can look into that when we now talk about prevention and management later. We're talking about neglected tropical diseases this morning. And I mean, it is interesting, but I think extremely important that we do. Dr. Hilary Shivachi is a health practitioner and surgeon, and we're looking at some of those this morning. We'll come back and then talk about interventions and also then what you can do to watch out for them and why this should not be neglected. We'll continue with that when we take a look after taking a look at weather and traffic. Don't go away. Could have this, right? So in terms of management, we're talking about management where there's already, infestation, and that's where you talk about things like surgery. What kind of possible surgery would you be doing on somebody who has significant worm infestation?
So let me speak as a surgeon where we get to meet these patients. We talked of the complication stage of worm infestation.
Yes.
And you had asked which type of complications these patients will present with.
Yeah.
Majorly, the patients who we see, the worms have become so much. They've taken up virtually all the space in the intestines. And your refuse or the contents of the intestines are not able to move. So they present with a blockage of the intestine, what we call in medical terms intestinal obstruction. That's one of the complications. Number two, these worms can perforate or penetrate the gut walls. And then now through that hole, they've created that refuse or the contents within the intestines are able now to spill into the general abdominal cavity. This usually comes with severe sepsis, and if it's not managed, these patients might go into shock, and eventually, I would actually shock you, but I've had a few patients end up in ICU because of worms after surgery. Then two, these worms can go to what we call ectopic or regions where they're not supposed to be. We have ducts that come off the gut that bring in juices in terms of digestion. We have one from the liver called the bile duct. We have one from the pancreas called the pancreatic duct. These worms can wiggle up into those orifices or holes and create blockages with the surgical complications. There's an organ called the appendix. These worms can also wiggle into the opening of the appendix, cause a blockage, and then you end up with an infection, which is called appendicitis. So in terms of surgery, we are trying to address these patients who present with these problems. Patients who present with intestinal obstruction will need to go into surgery, where we open the abdomen, are able to pull out the blocking intestines, the blocking worms from the intestines. I think if you looked at my phone, you'll see a few photos of the surgeries that we've done on children. The youngest I've done was 4 months old, who had worm infestation, which had caused the intestines to rot or die off. So you end up cutting a bit of the intestine out, and then joining the remaining. These patients will usually end up in ICU postoperatively for care. There are those who just have obstruction without the intestines dying off. You're able to pull out the worms. I hoped you had a photo. They look like spaghetti, nice spaghetti.
I will never eat spaghetti again.
Of course you will.
All in jest. But I'm on to get to the 4-month-old. 4-month-old, give or take 120 days, right? How would that be so severe in such a young person?
Remember, this infestation is happening by the dose of eggs you ingest.
But you would imagine that's a breastfeeding child.
Yes. Unfortunately, due to a socioeconomic situation sometimes, especially in the rural regions, you might find these children beginning to wean off at around 3 months, 2 months. So then this hygiene is not only for you.
Yes.
It's the mother, it's the caregivers, the siblings. So if the hygiene situation within the home or the locality is not good enough, because these children by their nature are explorers. So they're the guys who will be burrowing in the soil around there. And if there is soil that is contaminated with the feces that have those eggs, inherently this child will be infected.
Okay.
We have situations where we don't have adequate sanitation facilities. So usually I like telling people this scenario where you're traveling in a bus to Kakamega there, Bungoma. Then the call of nature comes calling. Usually just ask the driver to stop by some bush somewhere and we finish our business and we move on. Unfortunately, you've left a few probably eggs of these worms in there. So it's a process that is cyclic and it continues. Yes.
Okay. So at this point, you don't even want to make the assumption, but that, deworming was a process that took place in a household, or takes place in a household every 3 to 6 months kind of thing. Is that an adequate form of prevention management of worm infestation?
Yes, in terms of managing the worms, it's what you call like almost a three-pronged approach to it. There is the division or the unit of vector-borne and neglected tropical diseases at the ministry that is usually directly concerned with this. They have had some programs in terms of trying to address the situation. We have what we call the mass drug administration programs, either in schools or in the community using the primary healthcare givers. So one of the prongs is usually to eradicate or to kill or remove the worms that are already causing infection. So getting your dewormers on time at the time periods that are prescribed by your practitioner will go a long way in trying to eradicate this worm. So there are those programs that are in place for the same. Yes.
And I've seen Dr. Sultan Matendich, I think, as the director, vector-borne and tropical diseases director. And as you talk about it, there is in one of the ways that the government is handling this is through the community health promoters who've been sent to just talk to the public out there in terms of sanitation and making sure that hygiene as well is upheld to its highest standard. But as well as we talk about that, running water is something that is needed and all that, and this is information that people take for granted. So in terms of just the government being at the center and this not to be neglected but be given the priority that it deserves, where are we with that, if you have that information?
So probably that will be spoken to well by
Matendichere.
Matendichere even moved his Dr. Matendichere is now the deputy Director General, is no longer in that unit, but probably there will be better place to.
But are Kenyans generally just taking matters to do with hygiene and sanitation seriously as they should?
We still have a challenge, despite all these programs that have been set up by the ministry. So we have those mass drug administration, as you say, we have the trainings and sensitization programs that are going on in terms of mass and community education, in terms of hygiene, trying just to rectify that so that we get there. But there has been a challenge, as I said, mindset. To change the mindset usually is a process, and it usually takes time. So that's why we keep talking. How I came into this program is the department was training and doing sensitization in Bungoma.
Okay.
They were interested because Bungoma is one of, they've done mapping. There are around 17 counties that are endemic in terms of worm infestation. The 5 counties in western, some counties in Nyanza, lower eastern, and some in the coastal region. So they do sensitizations in these places. And why I came in as a surgeon was to try and bring out a perspective that has not been known to the public in trying to really compound the seriousness of
this thing.
This thing.
Okay.
Because
So I have to ask. I mean, I know that it falls in the category of neglected tropical diseases. I understand that. But then we also have other diseases which fell into almost a forgotten category, but for some reason still. With this worm infestation, with these intestinal worms, the numbers are too staggering for them to be neglected, number one. Number two is that with other diseases, I mean, we saw it with polio in East Africa, we saw it with polio in West Africa, we saw other diseases that were given huge government attention, whether it was funded or whether it was just because the certain ministries of health then were invested in making sure that it was kick out polio campaign and things like that, right? With worm infestation, with these intestinal worms, it's affecting people. I mean, look at the degrees that you're talking about. What about campaigns where we see schools, communities getting a single drop in the mouth of a baby every so often, would it be so difficult to have that campaign when you have CHPs, 100,000 of them around the country, walking around with a dewormer, for example? Because the numbers are too high for it to be forgotten. It's hitting you in the face every day.
You know, we've had this conversation in this country about social health
Promoters.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at the known sources where these worms are likely to reside. So then we understand the source from where the problem is.
Yes.
The preventative aspect of it. Now, this is one of the things that SHA is supposed to consider.
Yes.
Okay? Because someone doesn't have to be sick. Someone doesn't have to be infected. The things that need to be done in understanding the areas where these worms are most prevalent and how it is you need to attend or focus your attention onto this.
You have a very intricate medical health system. There are folks who know what they do. I mean, we started off the show this morning talking about the fact that these folks know what they're doing. They know. You're here, Dr. Shivaji. You know what you're doing. So the question that we're asking here, in terms of pushing for policy, certain things, it can't, by the sheer numbers, it cannot be a forgotten disease. It can't be. So when we are saying that, look at how it affects people, you want to think that, okay, it's just a worm in your belly, it's going to eat something and then it's going to disappear. Well, clearly not, because you're having surgery where you're removing spaghetti mounds from people's bodies. This is what we're talking about. So when you have a campaign where people are coming and knocking on your door and giving your child below 5 years old a polio drop, why can't we have the same thing where the same promoters are walking around giving a dewormer to children, giving a dewormer to entire families who for some reason can't afford it? Is this something that would make some kind of sense to reduce those numbers and to start to deal with this thing, to maybe eradicate them?
Yeah, the reason why you're having this conversation is entirely because there's actually a program in place, or programs in place that are addressing that. One, as you rightly put, in collaboration with the community
Health promoters
in terms of instituting what we call mass drug administrations. On this walking by household and giving these anti-helminths to children or people who are at risk. There are drugs that are affordable, there are drugs that are available. So it's a program that is already under the unit of vector-borne and neglected tropical diseases at the ministry. Two, if you've been around the western region in the counties, Trans Nzoia, Bungoma, Kakamega, there has been a school program for the same in terms of the children at school
dewormed.
Dewormed as part of that program. Then they usually go around as late as December. I was attending a sensitization of health workers in terms of talking about the same, how to pick these conditions and how to respond. So that I said in terms of diagnosis, you find we have difficulties probably in initially picking out the disease in the early stages until complication setting. So you're trying to avoid me as a surgeon meeting these patients. If they can be dealt with at the primary healthcare, which is the preventive arm, then we would be winning. Even better. We'll be winning this war. But as long as I keep seeing them in my operating room, then there's a problem. Then there's a problem that we need to have a conversation about.
There are parts of this country where these are not what we're discussing is not a problem, isn't it?
Yes.
There are parts of this planet where you don't even hear of those diseases.
They would think you lived in another planet.
Yes. So I mean, my question is a simple, straightforward one. What do these people do?
In terms of prevalence of these worms, it's as varied as from 6% all the way to 60% in the same country. Even if we are speaking about Kenya, there are counties where the prevalence is very low, in the range of probably 10%. There are counties that the ranges are up to 50%.
If they've done a survey on these things, then they will know why there's a high prevalence in some areas and a not so high prevalence in others. So the question still holds. What do these other people do? Because clearly they've got something right. That's why they don't have this problem. Yes.
Worms is a hygiene.
Simple
hygiene problem. Yes.
And Doctor as well, I'll just ask you of what some of our listeners are asking. And there's one Mia Samnia is asking, can you get these through pets, and as well as when you deworm everybody you live in the house is one of the ways of addressing that. Is that true? And finally, if you could give recommendations of some of the dewormers to those who are listening.
Okay, so I'll start with pets. And yes, I know we love pets. But those pets are usually, they walk outside there in the soil, they come, and some of us, our relationship with our pets is a close one. And that's one of the ways. There are actually some particular ones which use especially dogs and cats as an intermediate host. Or they pass through the dog or the cat carries it as an intermediate, and then now they transmit to you as now the definitive host. So yes, your pets can be a source of infection. That's why even for people who have pets, we still encourage hygiene in terms of cleaning those pets, in terms of deworming them, in terms of treating those pets. So you have to see a veterinary officer for your pets, so that you at least try and alleviate or reduce the chances of you contracting something from the pets.
Okay.
Two, she's asked about whether you treat someone,
you deworm the entire household.
Yes. That's one of the prongs. But remember, we said it's a cycle.
Yes.
As much as we are deworming, we also need to break the cycle. Before you break the cycle, there will be reinfection. So look at a situation where you are deworming your household, but within the locality, your source of water, people are releasing raw sewage into the water. People are using human refuse as manure. I've seen some stories in the media of where some farmers use human refuse sewage as, apparently it makes kumawiki
green and big.
That's so beautiful. Those eggs are passed on in that route. So as much as you're deworming, you can deworm.
We were just getting off the growth, Dr. You were doing well until now. You've just
gone back there.
So as much as we're deworming, we also have to address this public health problem.
Of course, definitely must be addressed. And another issue that must be addressed is that sometimes when you think about things like this, we get on this societal high horse, and you think that it's only people in lower social classes or whatever who might be affected. You could be walking around driving your vehicle in high heels, but you also have an issue. So here we are saying, then for the deworming, where maybe in your mind you think you're sure of your water sources, or you think you're sure of how often should you then deworm?
Yeah, that's a good perspective observation. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you some of these people, especially children we meet with complications, you find the parents are civil servants. They are people of means. Unfortunately, worms don't discriminate.
Yes.
It only gets you eating some contaminated food. Recently, I saw some city hawkers leaving their food trolleys in the city toilets.
Yes.
So you'll be passing by, even city here. And then grab something from there.
It's being called.
So it doesn't discriminate.
I don't think you know what you've just done.
I'm unable to.
It's called smocha.
As I speak, even I as Shivachi, my drop and I get infected, so it doesn't discriminate.
And I think, Doc, that takes us to there's another question that has been asked by Double N. Why the increased rates of H. pylori in Kenya, and does it have anything to do with the worms?
I'll answer him straight. H. pylori is a different condition entirely. H. pylori is a bacteria that infects the gut. But it's usually present in almost 30% of the population. Most of the people will be asymptomatic, but sometimes it might
Explain
be
asymptomatic.
Asymptomatic means you might have the bacteria but not exhibit any symptoms, so it doesn't bother you.
Meaning you're dying but you don't know.
But there are some few people who have conditions that might make the H. pylori exacerbate those conditions. But that's an entirely different condition in terms of peptic ulcer diseases and gastritis due with acidity. And so it's an entirely different conversation.
yeah.
It has nothing to do with worm infestation.
Okay, even as you wind this down, and in about a minute, when you talk about this being a hygiene issue, and I remember like when COVID came about and they said, look, you know what? If you do the things that you're supposed to do, this COVID essentially will not get to you. If you wear a mask, if you wash your hands, if you make sure that 1, 2, 3 are being done, you can actually keep this thing at bay. And I'm still going back to those numbers of 1.5 billion around, regions. If we have optimal hygiene, if you make sure that hygiene practices are drummed into the minds of community, if, health workers, if this whole system is working in this cyclical manner, can we actually see the eradication of this? Or is it a thing that these worms have decided they're here to stay? Can you see eradication with this pattern working properly?
With all this, that's actually our goal.
Okay.
Is per the WHO projections, they want this condition eradicated by 2030.
Okay.
Which means between now we have 5 years. Mm-hmm. We really need to get on our toes.
Indeed.
We really need to address the public. I think as human beings and can I dare say as Kenyans, we are a bit of ill-mannered.
Okay.
Yeah, ill-mannered people in terms of our waste disposal.
Right. Okay. That needs to be in check.
Everything goes. That one needs to be checked. If you go around and see the amount of sewage, sometimes there is just a drained raw into our rivers and water systems, you'll be surprised.
Something needs to be done.
So something needs to be done about that. But it's something, yes, that we can eradicate. If we go by the prongs, as we continue with the deworming, sensitization, we address the public health issues in terms of providing adequate sanitation facilities.
We can get it
something
done.
As simple as washing hands.
Absolutely.
During COVID, we did very well.
Yes.
How I hoped and I wish people would adopt the same
for this.
Yes.
Thank you so much. It's been an enlightening conversation and definitely one that we must keep having. Thank you so much. Dr. Hilary Shivachi has been our guest this hour, health practitioner and surgeon, and we've been talking about neglected tropical diseases, one of them being intestinal worms and how to manage them. Hope we can all get something from that this morning. Thank you for being here today. Asante Sana.
Thank you for having me.